Now we're going to be talking about diabetes mellitus. Diabetes mellitus is a group of metabolic disorders which lead to increased amount of blood glucose levels due to inability of the body to move them into the cells. First, we should review actually how glucose is handled inside the human body. Glucose, being the most important sugar of human body, has the capacity to enter pretty much any cell. And there are several ways how glucose can enter the cell depending on the cell type. However, in diabetes mellitus, is the insulin-mediated glucose transport that's effective, and this takes place in two major tissues of human body, adipose tissue and the skeletal muscle. Okay, and then the third type of cell that plays a big role in regulating the blood levels of glucose is the hepatocyte. Now, hepatocytes, the liver cells, they are not insulin dependent. They don't take in the glucose based on insulin, but what they do is they store the glucose in the form of glycogen inside and then release it into the blood if the glycemia decreases, the blood levels of glucose drop down. Okay, and so how the transport of glucose into and from the blood looks like. So you have insulin, and insulin is a hormone that would take the blood glucose and it would deposit it inside the adipocytes or skeletal muscle. While glucagon would be the hormone that would take glucose that's found in hepatocytes, for example, in the form of glycogen, and it would put it back into the blood. So how the blood sugar levels are maintained is that these two hormones, insulin and glucagon, work together to either put more glucose inside the blood or take the glucose from the blood and put it back into cells, into the tissues that are insulin sensitive. Not every tissue in human body accepts glucose depending on the levels of insulin. For example, your neurons, cardiomyocytes, they can take in glucose without any help of insulin. However, in the development of diabetes mellitus, the adipose tissue and skeletal muscle play a major role because they are insulin dependent. Okay, so next we can talk about how insulin exactly works. So let's say we're gonna take a piece of a membrane of adipocyte, maybe this piece of a membrane, and we're gonna zoom in and look what happens when insulin binds on that cell. So you're gonna have a double-layered membrane. On that membrane, you will have embedded insulin receptor. And inside that cell, inside the cytoplasm, you'll have vesicles, which will have glucose transporter on its biomembrane. So it looks something like this. Okay. And these channels in those vesicles, those are glucose transporters, more specifically GLUT4 transporters. Okay, and so what happens when insulin binds to the insulin receptor? So when the insulin binds to the insulin receptor, this will trigger a cascade of events that will lead to the movement of this vesicle that's found inside the cell towards the membrane. And then the vesicle will incorporate into the membrane along with all its transporters. So it will look something like this. Okay, and now all the glucose that's found outside of the cell can finally move inside the cell, adipocyte. Okay, and this is roughly how insulin works. And now if you think what could go wrong and what could eventually lead to inability of the cell to accept all this glucose, there are really two things that can go wrong. Either you might lose the insulin, and in this case, there would be nothing to activate the insulin receptors, and the cascade that would lead to incorporation of GLUT4 receptors inside or onto the membrane would not be triggered. Right? And in this case, the disease that occurs would be the diabetes mellitus type 1, often abbreviated as DM1. Or second thing that might happen is there will be something wrong with the receptor or one of the parts of that cascade. And there's something wrong with the receptor. It would be called diabetes mellitus type 2.